Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast show. My very special guest today is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She's at MIT in Boston, and she's got a lot to share. She's discovered a lot of amazing things recently, and she's got a brand new book coming out, which we'll talk about later. So it's a real privilege to have you on here, Stephanie, and talk about what you know.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, so take us back a little bit. You're a senior scientist at MIT Boston. So what made you get into this world of, scientific research and where you've ended up with this research around glyphosate?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story because most of my career was hacking code, writing computer code to build systems that allowed computers to talk to humans, to interact with humans through natural speech, precursors to Amazon Echo and the iPhone Siri. So that's become commoditized, and it's wonderful that it's like I can't even work in that field anymore because the companies have taken it over. And really about the time that it was becoming difficult for us to keep up because companies were getting excited about it. As academics, you just have small groups and you can't really compete with companies. But it was, fortunate that maybe fortunate at the same time, I was really looking at the autism rates and getting extremely concerned about the clear rise in autism year by year around the 2007 timeframe. I was getting really nervous about autism because the rates were going up, and they're still going up every year. Autism is going up, and we're like fine with it. I mean, it makes me very angry that the government doesn't even talk about the autism epidemic, which to me is a huge crisis right now. And of course, there's lots of other diseases that are also going up dramatically, as I soon found out. But I started with autism. I wanted to figure out there has to be something in the environment. What is it that's causing this epidemic? And looked for 5 years and looked at lots of different toxic possibilities that they were being exposed to, and ruled pretty much, I knew I was still missing the main ingredient by that point. After 5 years, I knew a lot about autism, but I couldn't figure it out. And I thought maybe antibiotics, because they were getting a lot of ear infections, they were messing up the gut, because I knew that gut dysbiosis was a huge component of autism. And you get toxic metabolites that are produced by pathogens that are overgrowing, and you've got an inflammation in the gut, leaky brain, toxins getting into the brain. All that stuff was clear to me, but I didn't know why the gut was so messed up. So that was where I was centered. And I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber was speaking on something called glyphosate, and I actually didn't know what it was. This was like 2012. I didn't recognize that word, which I can't believe right now because I'm so immersed in glyphosate every day of my life. So your audience, probably some of them don't know what glyphosate is either, but it's the active ingredient in Roundup. And of course, I knew Roundup. I had never used it because I don't like to use chemicals on my lawn. But of course, many of my neighbors had, and we all thought it was really safe and didn't worry about it. I thought it was pretty mild chemical, not up on par with some of the other things we're being exposed to. It's considered to be wonderful chemical because it's an herbicide. It kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it. And it's completely harmless to humans. I mean, that's the message we're getting. And people use it, without carelessly on their lawns. But the worst of it is that it's all over the food supply. And we've really become enchanted with Roundup as a way to grow food. It's really basic to our food system. And, we engineered these crops in the late 1990s that were GMO Roundup Ready crops, which were resistant. And that was through augmenting them with a genetically engineered gene that came from a microbe that could make a version of the enzyme that's very sensitive to glyphosate. They got a version of it from a microbe that was not sensitive to glyphosate, and that's how they were saved. So you could spray it all over the crop and not worry about it. All the weeds die. It makes it very, very easy to control weeds and makes growing food very cheap. And so, it was a big boon. We were all excited and everybody's happy and lots of food. And meanwhile, people are getting sick. So basically, we were fooled into believing that this chemical was safe. And it's a huge lie. And the more I look at it, the more I realize it's actually probably, maybe even the worst herbicide, maybe even the worst chemical used in agriculture. At this point, I feel like it's far more toxic than many of the other chemicals. And those are toxic too, of course. We have other herbicides that are known to be toxic, considered to be much more toxic than glyphosate. Things like atrazine and 2,4-D and dicamba and glufosinate, they're all bad. They're all toxic. And then we have the insecticides and the fungicides. I mean, it's a mess. We're using so many toxic chemicals on our food. And especially in the United States, we're very trigger happy. We have, 4% of the world's population, 20% of the world's glyphosate. So we get much more exposure per person than people do in other parts of the world. And it shows in terms of our diabetes, our obesity, our autism, our Alzheimer's, our gut problems, our liver problems, our kidney problems. All of these things are connected to chronic exposure to glyphosate. This is what I believe now, and I believe it very strongly.
Okay, so you've highlighted this problem in the environment, and you've highlighted the point that all these chronic diseases are increasing. And today we're talking about pain in particular, although you probably could replace pain with any of the other chronic diseases, because we know there's enough science now to show that inflammation is running the show. So what is the link between glyphosate,
It's a tricky word.
Yeah, glyphosate and this inflammatory response in the body?
It's actually very, very direct. And I have a book, a new book, Toxic Legacy, that's going to come out July 1st, how the Weedkiller Glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment. And this is available already for pre-order on lots of booksellers like Amazon and whatnot. So very excited about this book. I worked really hard on it, trying to keep it simple. So I worked very hard to dumb it. Well, I shouldn't say dumb it down, but make it more accessible to, people who don't have a lot of background in biology, because it's still pretty hard, but it's a lot easier than it could be if I had, I had to go through a lot of work to simplify it. But hopefully it'll be accessible to people, and I'm hoping it'll sell well and get the message out, because we really need to know about glyphosate. The inflammation is a direct hit, and it's and the book talks about it. So I have each chapter is on an individual disease, but there's a couple of chapters about the underlying mechanism of how glyphosate is toxic, and it's really unique to glyphosate and very insidious and cumulative and clever, really clever. And it has to do with glyphosate messing up I believe glyphosate is inserting itself into proteins by mistake in place of the amino acid glycine. And there's certain particular proteins that are especially susceptible because they're set up with a very good framework for fitting glyphosate in. And those a whole class of proteins called flavoproteins in particular are very trigger prone to pick up glyphosate where they shouldn't, at a critical site where they bind phosphate. And this it's very, very interesting. Once you just look at flavoproteins binding phosphate, then, and you say if it's not working, and in fact, many of these flavoproteins have been shown to be suppressed by glyphosate. So it's evidence. There's evidence in the studies about glyphosate's effects on enzymes. That is, in fact, what goes on with the enzyme that the plants are sensitive to. That's a place where the glycine, highly conserved glycine, binds phosphate. So that was the model that I used. If you take away that glycine in EPSP synthase, which is the enzyme that is affected in the plants, if you change that glycine into a different amino acid, such as alanine, the enzyme becomes completely insensitive to glyphosate. So that's a huge hint that glyphosate is affecting the enzyme by virtue of going into that protein in place of glycine. Glyphosate is a complete glycine molecule, except that it has extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom. And that's absolutely critical. So I think that it's a very unique mechanism. Nothing else that I know of works that way, to substitute for glycine during protein synthesis. And I think if you assume glyphosate's doing that, then everything makes sense. You can explain all those diseases. And I do that in the book with different diseases and different specific proteins that are going to be affected. And the effects are going to be what we see. And so it's quite remarkable. But the inflammation is key. It's really central. And the reason is because those flavoenzymes are messed up. And so there's critical enzymes in the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. There are critical enzymes in there that are flavoproteins and that play a crucial job in making the metabolism work properly in the mitochondria. And so when those enzymes get disrupted, you get mitochondrial disease. And when you get mitochondrial disease, you get inflammation. Glyphosate really messes up the ability for the mitochondria to maintain glutathione in its reduced state. And if you know about glutathione, essential antioxidant in the mitochondria, and glutathione deficiency is a major driver behind many of these inflammatory diseases. Glutathione actually contains a glycine residue, so it could even be getting messed up itself by glyphosate, with glyphosate substituting for the glycine in glutathione and causing it not to work properly. But beyond that, glyphosate messes up the enzymes. Glutathione gets oxidized in order to protect from the reactive oxygen species that are going on in the mitochondria. And then it has to be brought back down to its reduced state in order to be able to do that again. And there's an enzyme that does that. And that enzyme is getting messed up by glyphosate. So, glyphosate is disturbing the ability of the mitochondria to maintain a healthy level of antioxidants. which is causing the mitochondria to get damaged because they're releasing these reactive oxygen species, and they're causing genetic changes in the mitochondrial DNA. And then the mitochondria get broken. And then once you have broken mitochondria, then all hell breaks loose. And that's when you get into the inflammatory state. And the inflammation is actually part of the solution, because and that gets to be very complicated science. But it has, I should really bring up deuterium, because deuterium is something I've really been looking into a lot lately. And glyphosate messes up the enzymes that manage deuterium. Deuterium is heavy hydrogen. So, and of course, hydrogen is by far the most common atom in the body, huge amounts of hydrogen, and critical in all these oxidative reductive reactions. Deuterium is heavy hydrogen, has an extra neutron. So hydrogen is just one proton, one electron. Deuterium has an extra neutron, twice as heavy as hydrogen, but otherwise the same. And deuterium then substitutes for hydrogen everywhere that hydrogen can be. But when it substitutes, it changes the way things work. And the body has incredibly sophisticated mechanisms. I'm finding out, it's really, really fascinating science to make sure the mitochondria have very low levels of deuterium. And those flavoenzymes that get messed up by glyphosate are central to that mechanism. So basically, glyphosate doesn't allow the mitochondria to maintain the low deuterium that they need in order to make their ATPase pumps work properly. So the ATPase pumps get gummed up with extra deuterium, they get broken. And those, of course, are the central piece of the mitochondria that makes the ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. So the mitochondria get messed up, they can't make enough energy, and they destroy themselves by releasing all this reactive oxygen. And it's all, you can trace it back to the disruption of these enzymes that bind phosphate, these flavoenzymes, and other enzymes that bind phosphate are also messed up. So it's glyphosate's mucking around with all these enzymes, disturbing their ability to do their job correctly, ending up with extra deuterium, excess deuterium in the mitochondria, which is extremely toxic to them. And then the inflammation is extremely fascinating, because it is actually allowing the body to produce deuterium depleted water. The inflammation is central to make that happen. And you basically have to take oxygen and you turn it to superoxide. You turn it into superoxide initially, and then you turn it into hydrogen peroxide. And then finally you turn it into 2 water molecules. Oxygen has 2 oxygens. You basically stick 2 hydrogens on each of them and split them apart and make 2 water molecules in these steps. And those steps require inflammation in order to happen, because you've got to make the oxygen become O2 minus. That's the superoxide to start with. That's what the inflammation is doing. It's making deuterium depleted water. And it's basically another way to do it, because the normal way is broken. So once you've broken the normal safe way to make deuterium depleted water, you have to take this other approach, which involves oxidative damage to the tissues, wherever that's happening. And then people get inflammation in different places depending upon their disease. So if you have rheumatoid arthritis, you've got inflammation in the joints. If you've got Alzheimer's, you've got inflammation in the brain. People have inflammation in the gut. Each one of those places, where you're getting inflammation, is a place where you're making deuterium depleted water. This is what I believe, and this is what I'm working on in my latest research.
Wow. Well, that's a lot of information. But yeah, so this inflammatory process, maybe if you could touch on, if you cut yourself, you heal. There's an inflammatory process going on, which is different from chronic inflammation, which is this thing that we're seeing with chronic diseases. So how does that link between the acute phase, which is a protective phase, and then the chronic disease state as time goes on?
Well, very, very interesting. And in fact, what I see, and I've written a lot in my book about the glyphosate messing up sulfate. And I think sulfate is central to this story, and in particular, heparin sulfate. I've identified heparin sulfate deficiency, or deficiency in sulfation of heparin sulfate. Heparin sulfate is a very interesting molecule. Do you know about heparin sulfate?
Well, from back in medical school days, when we used to give, anticoagulation and
yeah, right,
for surgery, take them off warfarin, put them on heparin drips, and then they can do the surgery, and the clotting time is less, and therefore they can go through their surgery and go back on to their heparin, and then 2-3 days later, warfarin is high enough in the dose, so therefore you go back onto warfarin. But anyway, that's my 30 years ago.
That's your exposure to it. Heparin sulfate is extremely fascinating, and I've read many, many papers on it, and I still find new papers. I just found one this morning I'm dying to read. So I love the science of it. I identified heparin sulfate deficiency as a problem in autism early on, even long before I knew about glyphosate. Yeah. Heparin sulfate in the brain ventricles, very, very clear. In fact, if there was an experiment on mice where they actually engineered them to have defective sulfation of heparin sulfate inside their brain ventricles in that cerebrospinal fluid. And if they just made that one change to these otherwise normal mice at birth, they could produce all the symptoms of mouse autism just from that one change, being unable to make heparin sulfate. So heparin sulfate is super, super fascinating. And it's all over the blood. It lines all the blood vessels. Mm-hmm. And it has varying degrees of sulfation. There can be more, there can be less, there can be different places. It gets sulfated in different places, and it matters. It's a giant signal, actually, the pattern by which it's sulfated. And heparin sulfate is it binds to all kinds of interesting biologically active molecules in the blood, including proteins. Lots of different interesting things in the blood bind to heparin sulfate. That attaches them to the membrane of the endothelial cell that's lining the vessel wall. So you've got the blood vessel, you've got all this heparin sulfate all around the blood vessel, and you've got things coming through the blood that are going to attach themselves to that heparin sulfate. For example, LDL particles, they attach. That's the statin drug thing, where you have to take statin drugs to reduce your LDL. LDL binds to the heparin sulfate first, and then from there it goes into the cell through this endocytosis process that produces these lysosomes. Lysosomes are the digestive system of the cell. They're like these particles inside the cell that are they become very acidic, and that allows them to break things down. So the LDL comes in, attaches to the heparin sulfate, and then the heparin sulfate and the LDL come together into the cell. And the heparin sulfate then gets modified to take the sulfate off of the heparin sulfate. And that sulfate then provides an acidic, it creates the acidic environment that it needs in order to be able to break down anything it's trying to digest. So what happens when you don't have enough sulfate is that your lysosomes get broken. And when your lysosomes get broken, you can't clear cellular debris. And meanwhile, you're releasing all this reactive oxygen that's creating cellular debris. So you're creating it, but you can't clear it because your digestive system is broken. And that's because you don't have enough heparin sulfate. And the thing is that's really beautiful about the oxidizing process in the inflammatory response is that one thing that it does is it oxidizes, it takes homocysteine or cysteine, these are sulfur containing amino acids. It takes the sulfur off of them and it oxidizes it to sulfate. According to that, because of that oxidizing is essential. That's caused by this inflammatory response. It's essential to make sulfate. So not only are you, and on top of that, heparin sulfate binds deuterium. So what you're supposed to do is have lots of heparin sulfate binding and trapping deuterium so that the fluid blood is deuterium depleted. And then that's going to make the mitochondria deuterium depleted. So the fluid water needs to be low deuterium. And the way you achieve that is by trapping the deuterium in those heparin sulfate proteoglycans. They trap gelled water and they trap deuterium in the gelled water. They release protons that are deuterium depleted. And those protons get fed into the mitochondria and into the lysosomes to provide the acid, the acid environment that you need in both of those places to drive the whole system the way it works. So the lysosomes depend on protons that are not deuterons. They want them to be protons that are coming in from the extracellular space that are being driven out of the gelled water that's being formed by the sulfate in the heparin sulfate proteoglycans. It's an incredible system. And Gerald Pollack is an expert on gelled water. I don't know if you know about gelled water and all of that. So the water gets gelled. It's really cool because the water gets gelled along the edge of the blood vessel. And then the gelled water becomes negatively charged. It actually pushes out protons. And those protons gather at the surface, at the interface between the gelled water and the liquid water. So you could think of having Jell-O in a bowl and pouring water on top of it. That interface between that liquid water and that gelled water that's in the Jell-O is the place where the Jell-O would push out the protons to have protons lined up along the edge. And those protons can get channeled into the cell at special places. They get channeled into the cell and along the cytoskeleton. They travel along the cytoskeleton and they go into the lysosomes and the mitochondria to provide them with that low pH, component that they need in order to work properly. So it's feeding those protons to both the lysosomes and the mitochondria to make them healthy. And those protons are low in deuterium because of the fact that the gelled water that's formed by the heparin sulfate is trapping deuterium and mostly releasing protons. Because the deuterons are heavier, they bind better, they stay with They stick with the sulfate. They bind to the sulfate preferentially,
Mm.
so that what you release is reduced in deuterium. It's an amazing system.
So it's amazing. Yeah. Well, one thing I was reading recently was about alkaline water.
Yes.
What's the role? I know you can't give advice because, you know, you're not an MD. We don't give advice here, we talk. But, you know, what's the role of alkaline water in this system that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't actually have a good answer to that. I don't think I've figured out alkaline water. It might be that it has electrolytes in it, which is sort of like providing the energy that you need to do things like oxidizing hydrogen sulfide to make sulfate. So it could be that it's one that I really like is deuterium depleted water. Have you heard of that?
No.
I'm actually taking it every day now, and I take almost nothing. I take two things really: Epsom salt baths for the sulfate, because that's a magnesium sulfate, and deuterium depleted water. And you can actually purchase that on the web. You can buy it with extremely low deuterium, like only 10 parts per million, whereas normally water has like 155 parts per million of deuterium. And so what I do is I mix it with normal water to make it about like maybe 80 or 90 parts per million, because that's really natural water never gets any lower than that. It's interesting. Different sources of natural water have different amounts of deuterium, and in particular, glacier water is low in deuterium. And people who live this is how this deuterium problem was discovered. Actually, it's really interesting. It's out of Russia, is where they first realized that deuterium plays an important role in biology. And they had these people who were living way up north, Siberia. They had a pretty bad diet, or you would think it was a bad diet, because they had such a short growing season that they really couldn't grow crops. And so they ate a lot of seal blubber. I mean, they had a very high animal fat diet, very low vitamin C. I mean, they just basically had, no fruits, very few fruits and vegetables, but lots of meats and fats, animal-based fats. But they were extremely healthy, and many of them lived well over 100 years old, and nobody could figure out why they were so healthy, despite this really cold climate and this really, depleted, restricted food diet. They were super healthy. And so somebody got interested in that and started trying to figure it out. And they determined that their water was very low in deuterium, like maybe 90 parts per million instead of 155, but it made a huge difference. They just were getting less deuterium, so they had less issues with deuterium messing up their mitochondria, and that allowed them to live longer. So I actually think your lifespan is probably tied to your ability to keep your mitochondria systemically low in deuterium. That's really directly linked to longevity, I suspect. And so it was Russia that figured out this whole thing with deuterium, and then it's actually making its way to this country now. I learned about it through Laszlo Boros. He's a professor at UCLA in pediatric oncology, really interesting guy. And he's been helping me to become educated on deuterium, but it is really, really fascinating. And like I said, metabolism, a lot of things in metabolism don't make sense as far as how when you look at where different enzymes are doing their thing, so you have actually sort of some complicated steps that go on. Like, for example, cholesterol, you're taking cholesterol and then you need to turn it into other things. It gets oxidized and gets converted into all kinds of interesting things, like all the sex hormones, all the steroids, the steroid hormones in the adrenal glands and in the testes and the ovaries, all these testosterone and estrogen and adrenaline, all those things are coming out of cholesterol. And so the cholesterol actually has to be transported inside the mitochondria. It has to go across the mitochondrial membrane to get inside the mitochondria. And then it's an enzyme in the mitochondria that actually modifies, it oxidizes, hydrolyzes it, and modifies the cholesterol into something a little different. Then that modified cholesterol has to be taken out of the mitochondria, and then you stick a sulfate onto it, and then you ship it out. So for example, the adrenal glands, they make a lot of sulfated steroids that are derived from cholesterol, but you've got to jump through hoops. You've got to get it inside, you've got to get it inside the mitochondria, back out of the mitochondria. Like, why does it have to do it inside the mitochondria? It's weird, right? So when you look at all the different things that happen inside the mitochondria that require difficulty in terms of getting the substrate where it needs to go, every one of those enzymes is involved with making deuterium depleted water. It's a byproduct of the reaction. And this is where I've gotten really fascinated with digging around different enzymes, finding out where their action takes place, and then asking why is it there? And you can really explain it, because the enzymes that are outside the mitochondria are actually producing molecules that have hydrogen that's almost guaranteed not to be deuterium. They'll have a hydrogen atom stuck on in a particular spot. Then that molecule with this super hydrogen comes into the mitochondria, and then you have an enzyme ready to go there that takes that hydrogen off and puts it into the mitochondria to provide it with a healthy hydrogen atom. It's really, really fascinating. All of a sudden, it makes so much makes sense in terms of, this is what Laszlo talks about too, that the steps that go on in the breaking down of sugar to make, you make carbon dioxide and oxygen, make ATP, right? With it's sort of the famous thing. You eat nutrients, your cells metabolize those nutrients, eventually breaking them down all the way to water and carbon dioxide. And you're adding oxygen in to do that. But then you're also using the energy that you've extracted from those molecules to make the ATP. That's the whole system of metabolism, but it goes through many extra steps that don't seem like they're necessary. It's like really weird. Why does it do it in such a complicated way? When you look at it as a problem of making sure that the hydrogens that are on those nutrients are not deuterium, you have to go through steps to clean them of their deuterium in order to make them available for the metabolism so that you can protect the mitochondria from damage. It's really, really fascinating.
So back to Roundup. So how do we avoid Roundup?
Yeah, organic, certified organic diet, I think is really an important part of the answer. And I think that people will find their health improves. I think by 3 months of eating certified organic, they're going to see a lot of things are improving in their health. I know for me personally, I used to get urinary tract infections on a sort of regular basis. Like even it got to be once a year, I could almost guarantee I was going to get a UTI in the spring. And I think from the loss of vitamin D in the winter, I would just very annoying because I try to treat it without drugs because I hate antibiotics, and finally give up and take an antibiotic. And luckily the antibiotic always cleared it right away, but I was really annoyed. I was taking D-mannose, and drinking cranberry juice and all that stuff and just not managing to get rid of it until I took the antibiotic. It just made me really angry. After I started eating organic diet, it went away completely. I don't get UTIs anymore. So that's just, a minor example, but I think any kind of gut dysbiosis and of course it's sort of a dysbiosis of the biome of the urinary tract is causing these UTIs. It's the same thing. So eating organic, certified organic is crucial. I think eating a high sulfur diet, because I think sulfate is really central to being able to clear cellular debris and many other things, also to be able to trap deuterium. So sulfate is extremely important. And the whole system that makes sulfate is vulnerable to glyphosate. And I talk about it in my book, but many of the enzymes involved in making sulfate and attaching it to the heparin sulfate are vulnerable to glyphosate disruption. So you need to get rid of the glyphosate. That'll help you to heal the gut. And then I think probiotics are really good. So taking, sauerkraut. I eat sauerkraut and apple cider vinegar, organic, all organic. And even fermented cheeses and sour cream. I love all of those things. So I eat a lot of dairy, but not so much milk, really more high fat dairy. Butter is fantastic, actually. My fats are basically butter and organic pork lard. We use lard mostly in cooking, stir fried with lard, and stay away from the vegetable fats. And many of them are contaminated with glyphosate if you're not eating them organic. And although we use olive oil in our organic olive oil in our salad dressing, but other than that, we mostly eat animal-based fats. And tend towards a high-fat diet. I think try to stay away from the carbs. So go more towards high fat, and also towards, if you live near the sea, I think the seafood is extremely healthy. Oysters and scallops and crabs and lobster, all of that. Are extremely healthy foods. They're very nutrient dense. So they have a lot of the minerals. I didn't get into this, but glyphosate chelates minerals and messes them up. So you end up with mineral deficiencies in your food if you've been exposed to glyphosate and if your food has been exposed to glyphosate when it was grown. So we really need to eat nutrient dense foods with lots of minerals and vitamins. The B vitamins are all messed up by glyphosate. Many of them come out of the shikimate pathway, and your gut microbiome has the shikimate pathway. So it's using it to make the aromatic amino acids, which are essential because our cells can't make those, but it also uses them as to make B vitamins and thyroid hormone, and many essential molecules that we depend upon come out of that shikimate pathway, which is disrupted in the gut microbiome by the glyphosate. That's a critical piece of the puzzle that causes a lot of different disease symptoms. So fermented foods, high sulfur foods, high animal fat, everything organic.
Yeah.
Sunlight, getting out in the sun without sunscreen and without sunglasses, getting out in the sun, exposing your eyes. It's important to get sunlight to the eyes because the pineal gland, which sits right behind the eyes, uses sunlight to make sulfate. And that sulfate is then used attached to melatonin in the evening, when it makes the melatonin, it releases it as melatonin sulfate into the cerebral spinal fluid. And that is supplying the sulfate to replenish heparin sulfate in the brain, which, as I said, is linked to deficiency, is linked to autism. So very important to get for your children to get out in the sunlight without sunglasses. I really want to emphasize that because I see little 2-year-olds wearing sunglasses, and I think it's a very big mistake.
Wow. Well, thank you for introducing a lot of new ideas like sulfur foods. Like, give us some example. Is like fermented foods, is that sulfur foods? But I know there's more than that.
Well, there is sulfur in some of the, like I love cabbage, fermented cabbage, that's the sauerkraut. So cabbage itself is a good source of sulfur. All the cruciferous vegetables,
Right.
broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, we eat a lot of those. They're a really good source of sulfur. And then, of course, sulfur like grass-fed beef and organic eggs. That's really a great thing to eat. I like eggs, and they're very nutritious, high density. You want to look for nutrient dense foods with healthy fats as a primary, really healthy food to take. So.
It's funny, this weekend I bought some, good quality pork, and it was, no antibiotics and all the rest. So I gave it to my kids, and there was this cold lard around it. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to try giving them this fat.
Oh, yes. And did they eat it?
And they did. It was like, oh, I'm not eating that again.
Yeah, it takes some getting used to, I guess, eating fat. We've been trained to trim the fat, in America.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get into the arachidonic acid. I don't know if we still have time to talk about that, because that's so fascinating. And that's all part of this inflammatory response thing, because the inflammation that happens in response to this miserable situation where the deuterium is wrecking the mitochondria, that inflammation actually oxidizes arachidonic acid through an enzyme called lipoxygenase. And in doing so, it produces deuterium depleted water. So I think that lipoxygenase is triggered by inflammation. The inflammatory response induces upregulation, induces increased production of lipoxygenase, which converts arachidonic acid into these signaling molecules that then increase the inflammatory response. So there's a sort of positive feedback loop. It's like, we need inflammation, and the inflammation is making this deuterium depleted water, which is what they're looking for. And then, of course, it's also trying to make the sulfate. And when these pathways get snagged because glyphosate's wrecking things, it keeps going. So the inflammation never turns off because the resolution doesn't happen, because glyphosate's messing up all the steps. So, and you get more inflammation because the enzyme's not working properly. It isn't doing its job to grab those electrons and put them where they need to go. And instead, they're getting loose and they're causing collateral damage. But arachidonic acid is also a precursor to an endogenous cannabinoid. It's a sort of natural form of marijuana. And that is done through a cytochrome P450 enzyme. So arachidonic acid has different directions it could go. As far as it gets turned into all kinds of different things. And it's a really complicated story. If you try to read the literature, all these different complicated names of all these molecules that are modified versions of arachidonic acid, which arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fat. It's very common in our diet, particularly in the vegetable oils. So you get a lot of arachidonic acid if you're eating a lot of vegetable oils. And if you're eating non-organic ones, you're getting a lot of glyphosate along with it. And the glyphosates are messing up the system that would normally allow it to get converted into this endogenous cannabinoid, which would help to alleviate pain. So instead, that gets blocked because glyphosate blocks all the cytochrome P450 enzymes. And it does so because of this flavoprotein issue that I mentioned before. It wrecks the enzyme that restores the cytochrome P450 enzymes to their reduced state, just the same as the glutathione. It's the same story. Both of them end up oxidized and useless because the enzymes that are supposed to bring them back don't work. And they don't work because glyphosate's messing them up. And so you can't get the arachidonic acid to turn into the endogenous cannabinoid because that enzyme is blocked by glyphosate. So instead, the arachidonic acid gets rerouted towards this other pathway with these lipoxygenases that causes all this damage and all this inflammation. So it's very, very interesting to look at. There's many different molecules that get messed up. Another one is aromatase. This is directly connected to autism, because aromatase is a very important enzyme during development. and it converts testosterone into estrogen. And it's also a cytochrome P450 enzyme. So all the cytochrome P450 enzymes get disrupted by glyphosate. And it's been shown experimentally that aromatase gets suppressed during development. And it's also been shown, even in human studies, that the embryo is exposed to too much testosterone in utero because testosterone is not getting converted to estrogen in adequate amounts because aromatase is getting disrupted by glyphosate. So that's a piece of the autism puzzle as well, because excess testosterone is then linked to autism. And it's also linked to, in girls, it's linked to polycystic ovary syndrome. Too much testosterone in utero causes girls to end up with polycystic ovary syndrome, which is an epidemic right now. Something like 20% of the population is suffering from it. And it's the most common problem associated with infertility. They get, their periods go away, they can't produce a baby. And of course, infertility is also an epidemic right now. And I have a whole chapter in my book on the reproductive system. And I talk about both how the sperm get messed up and also the female reproductive system gets messed up by glyphosate.
Well, Stephanie, thanks so much for coming on and just outlining a lot of the subjects in a lot of detail. And I'm sure much of the audience are thinking, oh my gosh, what is all this about? But, get the book. It's made into more simple language, and you'll be able to understand, maybe answer a lot of your personal questions about certain diseases. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we got to go back to nature. We got to go back to, how God made the earth and all the foods in it. And the more we trample on that, the more we get in trouble. And I think we're seeing that in the last 20 years plus. So well done. And thank you so much for your research, your passion. And it seems to be ever growing with time. It'll never stop, I'm sure. Yeah. And, I just want to make one little quote from David Perlmutter, which is in the book. And he says, this is unquestionably one of the most important books of our time. And David has written amazing books called Grain Brain and Brainwash and others. And I've read some of those. So if he is saying this, he's a leading, I think he's a neurologist. Is he a neurologist? I think he is.
I'm not sure. I know he's done all this work on that. Of course, celiac disease is another one that glyphosate's causing because of glyphosate in the wheat.
Yes, he's done a lot of work and written extensively on this. So this is a major move forward, and I just hope your book is a raving success. I look forward to my copy coming in the mail, and it's published 1 month from today.
You're right.
July 1st, 2021. So get a copy, everybody, and support the movement of getting healthier and helping our pain and finding solutions, because that's what this podcast is all about. So thanks again, Stephanie. It's been great to meet you.
Thank you.